When a big company sets up shop or sources materials from halfway across the world, it really doesn't happen in a vacuum, does it?
No, definitely not.
Like a new factory changes things locally, water, air, jobs, and
Mhm.
getting stuff like cocoa or cobalt, well, that affects the people living there, maybe indigenous communities even. Businesses just have these tangible impacts.
That exact relationship, that kind of two-way street between what a business does and the communities around it, that's precisely what we're digging into today. We're
Okay.
looking at a specific source, a detailed one, an excerpt from ESRS S3.
ESRS S3, right? That's one of the European sustainability reporting standards. And S3 is all about how companies report on their impacts on affected communities. Is that
That's the one, yeah.
yeah.
And our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack this standard, pull out the key requirements, the important insights, and figure out what it actually means for companies to be transparent about their social footprint, especially regarding the people, their operations, and crucially, their value chains touch.
So it's like a shortcut to understanding how this major reporting standard is pushing for more openness about social impacts.
Exactly. Think of it as getting a fast track on a really key piece of the puzzle for sustainability reporting.
Okay, let's jump in, starting right at the top. What's the main goal, the core objective of ESRS S3? What's it trying to achieve?
Well, the main objective is pretty straightforward, actually. It's to help anyone reading a company's sustainability statement understand its significant impacts on affected communities.
And not just the neighbors next door, right?
No, absolutely not. It includes communities linked through their whole value chain, their products, services, even their business relationships. It's broad.
Got it. And what specifically should I, as a reader of that report, understand from these S3 disclosures?
The standard lays out a few key things you should get. First, how the company affects communities. Is it positive, negative, happening now, or just a potential risk? And importantly, where are those impacts likely to be the most severe?
Okay, the how and where. What else?
Second, the actions. What is the company actually doing to prevent, reduce, or, fix negative impacts? And how are they handling the related risks and opportunities?
Right, the practical response.
Third, the report should explain the nature, type, and extent of the big risks and opportunities. And this isn't just from the impacts they cause, but also from the company's dependencies on communities.
Dependencies. That's an interesting term. It sort of implies the company needs the community, not just impacts it.
It does, exactly, like meeting local workers, or maybe just needing the community's their trust to operate smoothly.
A social license to operate?
Precisely. And the standard really leans into this. It highlights that depending on a community for labor, land access, whatever, creates real risks if that relationship breaks down. Think disruptions, protests, bad PR.
But also opportunities.
Yes, definitely opportunities if the relationship is good. Easier hiring, smoother operations, maybe being seen as a partner locally. It really shows communities aren't just passive, they're actors the business relies on.
And the fourth thing to understand.
Yes, the financial side. Users should get a sense of the financial effects of these risks and opportunities on the company itself, short, medium, and long term.
Okay. Now, you mentioned impacts, but does the standard get specific about the kinds of impacts, particularly regarding human rights?
It does. It calls out certain rights explicitly. It covers economic, social, and cultural rights. Think basics like housing, food, water, land rights, security.
So fundamental needs.
Yes. And also civil and political rights, freedom of expression, assembly, the safety of human rights defenders. But a really key point, a specific focus, is on the particular rights of indigenous peoples.
Like what specifically?
Things like free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, which is huge. Also self-determination and cultural rights. That explicit mention of indigenous rights in FPIC is, I think, a really significant aspect of S3.
It sounds quite comprehensive. Now, you mentioned this fits into a bigger picture. How does S3 interact with the other ESRS standards? It's not just on its own, is it?
No, definitely not. It's part of a whole system. Basically, S3 kicks in when a company does its materiality assessment. That's the process where they figure out their most important sustainability topics and finds that impacts, risks, or opportunities related to communities are, well, material, significant.
And that materiality assessment process is covered elsewhere.
Exactly. That's detailed in ESRS 2, which lays out the general requirements. So S3 needs to be read alongside ESRS 1 and 2, plus the other social standards S1 on the company's own workforce, S2 on workers in the value chain, and S4 on consumers. They're all interconnected.
Okay, so materiality triggers S3. Once it's triggered, how does the standard push companies to connect these community issues to their core strategy and business model. That seems like a really important link to make.
It's absolutely crucial. And yes, the standard really pushes for this. It wants companies to show that thinking about communities isn't just some side department thing. It needs to be baked into how they actually do business.
How does it require them to show that?
It points to specific requirements back in ESRS S3. For instance, companies have to explain how the views, the interests, the rights of affected communities, including human rights, indigenous rights, actually inform their strategy and their business model. It positions affected communities as key stakeholders whose input really needs to count at that high level.
And they have to show the connection between the impacts and their strategy, not just that they listened.
Precisely. They need to disclose how community impacts actually stem from or are linked to their strategy and business model. And, this is key, how those impacts might make the company change or adapt its strategy.
Ah, so it's a feedback loop.
Kind of, yeah. They also need to show how the major risks and opportunities that come from impacts and dependencies tie back to the strategy and business model. The insight here is that the standard wants proof that companies understand this cause and effect between their core business decisions and what happens to communities on the ground.
So it's not just, here are our impacts, but more like, here's how our business approach leads to these impacts, and here's how that might force us to rethink things.
Yeah.
That feels quite powerful.
It is. It moves beyond simple reporting.
Now, who exactly counts as an affected community? If they're materially impacted, who triggers these disclosures? Is it just people living right next door?
No, it's much wider, reflecting, how complex modern supply chains are. The standard includes communities near the company's own sites, factories, facilities, even remote ones, maybe downstream if there's pollution.
Okay.
It covers communities all along the value chain near suppliers, logistics hubs, distribution routes. It includes communities at the very ends, like where raw materials are extracted or where waste ends up. And again, it explicitly names indigenous peoples as potentially affected communities.
And the standard wants detail on the nature of impacts, too. Not just that impacts exist.
Yes, absolutely. Companies need to describe them clearly. Are they, widespread systemic issues in an area, say, ongoing health problems from pollution near a cluster of factories? Or are they specific incidents, a chemical spill, maybe? Or even conflict related to the company's presence, perhaps how security forces respond to protests.
That's quite specific.
It even mentions potential impacts from the green transition, like increased mining for critical minerals affecting local communities. And they need to distinguish between actual impacts and potential future impacts.
And you flagged something earlier, identifying communities at greater risk.
Yes, this is a really critical point of sensitivity in the standard. Companies must identify if certain communities are more vulnerable, maybe they're physically isolated or have limited access to services, or perhaps existing social structures make certain groups, like women, more susceptible to negative effects. Think about large land deals affecting women's traditional farming rights more than men's.
So it requires looking at intersectionality.
Exactly. The standard emphasizes looking at overlapping factors, ethnicity plus poverty, or migrant status plus gender. These intersections can really multiply the risk of harm.
Which means the risks and opportunities might be very specific to certain groups, not a general community issue.
Absolutely. A land rights issue might be acutely material for an indigenous group, but maybe not for residents near a corporate office. The company needs to show that level of understanding.
The standard gives examples of this strategic link.
It does. It gives examples of how strategy or business model choices can create risks. Things like setting project deadlines so tight there's no time for proper community consultation, or operating where land tenure is unclear or indigenous rights aren't respected by law. Even aggressive tax planning that hits developing countries' revenues, or maybe moving into high-risk areas leading to protests and delays.
What about resource use?
Yeah, intensive water use in a dry area leading to conflict, boycotts, lawsuits. It even covers low likelihood, high impact risks like dependency risks. Imagine a natural disaster causes an industrial accident that devastates a nearby community. The risk stems partly from that operational dependency on stable conditions right next to people.
Wow, that really connects the dots between high-level strategy and potential real-world harm. Okay, so companies identify all this. How does S3 then require them to show they manage it all? This looks like the biggest chunk of the standard.
It is quite detailed, yeah. It breaks down the management aspect into several key disclosure areas. First up, S3.1, policies.
So do they have the right rules written down?
Essentially, yes. They need to describe their policies for managing these material impacts, risks, and opportunities. The goal is to show they have formal frameworks covering the whole cycle, identifying issues, assessing them, managing them, and importantly, providing remedy if things go wrong.
Do they need to specify who the policies cover?
Yes. Do they apply to specific communities or all affected ones? Are there special provisions for indigenous peoples? They also need to disclose relevant commitments to human rights, referencing international standards like the UN Guiding Principles or OECD guidelines, and explain how they check for compliance.
Focusing on.
Focusing on the material stuff. Respecting human rights, especially indigenous rights, engaging properly, and having remedy processes. They even have to say if there have been reported cases where these principles weren't respected in connection with communities, either in their own operations or the value chain.
And it's not enough to just have the policy.
Right. The guidance adds that they need to explain how they communicate these policies. Who needs to know? Employees, contractors, suppliers, workers, investors, and crucially, the communities themselves. How do they do it? Flyers, websites, meetings. Is it translated? Are there graphics? It has to be accessible.
Okay, makes sense. Policies first. What's next?
Next is S3-2, engagement processes. Basically, how do they actually talk with communities?
Not just to them, but with them.
That's the idea. Companies have to describe their general processes for engaging with affected communities or their chosen representatives about impacts. The key objective here is for users to understand if and how the company engages as part of its due diligence. And critically, how do community perspectives actually feed into the company's decisions?
So again, it's about showing the engagement lead somewhere. It's not just ticking a box.
Precisely. They need to disclose details like, is engagement direct or through credible intermediaries? When does it happen? Project planning, operation, closure. What type of engagement? Is it just informing people, consulting them, or actively involving them in participation? How often does it happen?
Who's responsible internally?
Yes. Which function or senior role drives this? And how do they know if the engagement is even effective? They also need to show how they specifically engage vulnerable groups, like women and girls, and how they respect indigenous people's rights. This includes consulting indigenous communities on the way engagement happens, the mode, the parameters, not just the subject matter.
Consulting on the consultation itself, that's quite meta.
It is, but it reflects deep respect for the community's own protocols and decision-making processes. The standard explicitly links this to negotiating in good faith to get FPIC for anything affecting indigenous lands, resources, culture, or involving relocation.
What if a company just doesn't have a process?
They have to disclose that. They can optionally provide a time frame for setting one up. The guidance also suggests giving details like staff training, especially on indigenous rights, and providing real examples of where community input actually changed a company decision or plan.
Okay, policies, engagement. What about when things go wrong? Or communities need to raise a concern? That leads to S3-3, remediation processes and channels for raising concerns.
Right. This is all about pathways for fixing problems and making voices heard. Companies must describe how they provide or help provide remedy for negative impacts they're linked to. And they need to describe the channels available for communities to raise concerns.
So transparency on how communities can actually get issues addressed.
Exactly. Do communities have formal ways to communicate needs or complaints? Are these direct to the company or maybe through third parties like NGOs or industry bodies? They need to describe their general approach to remedy when they cause or contribute to harm, including how they check if the remedy actually worked.
What details do they need on the channels themselves?
They need to list the specific channels, grievance mechanisms, hotlines, dialogue processes, whatever they use. How do they support channels in their business relationships, like maybe requiring suppliers to have them? How do they track issues? And, crucially, how do they ensure the channels are effective? This includes getting input from the people who actually use them.
It sounds like it's about accessibility and trust, not just having a channel exist on paper.
Totally. They need to disclose if communities are even aware of these channels, and if they trust them, maybe using survey data. And very importantly, what policies are in place to protect users from retaliation, confidentiality, privacy, options for anonymity. These are vital.
And if they don't have channels?
Same as engagement. Disclose it, optionally provide a time frame. The standard points heavily to international guidelines, like the UNGPs, on what makes a grievance mechanism effective. Legitimacy, accessibility, predictability, fairness, transparency, rights compatibility, continuous learning, and dialogue.
Anything specific for indigenous peoples here?
Yes. It mentions that remedy processes for indigenous people should take into account their own customs, traditions, rules, and legal systems.
Okay, that covers the structures. Now for the actual doing. S3-4. taking action and effectiveness. This sounds like where the rubber meets the road.
It really is. This disclosure requires companies to get specific about how they act on all this, addressing impacts, managing risks, pursuing opportunities, and crucially, how they track the effectiveness of those actions. They need to summarize their action plans and the resources they're putting behind them, linking back to ESRS 2 requirements.
So what specific actions regarding impacts do they report?
For negative impacts, they list actions taken, planned, or underway to prevent or mitigate them, and actions for remedy if harm has already occurred. For positive impacts, they describe any additional initiatives they're undertaking. For both, they need to explain how they track and assess if these actions are actually working. Are they achieving the intended outcomes?
Do they need to explain how they decide what action to take?
Yes. The processes for identifying needed action, their approach to specific impact types, say, related to land acquisition versus operational pollution versus site closure, and how they make sure remedy processes are available and effective when needed.
And similar details for risks and opportunities.
Yep. Actions planned or underway to mitigate material risks, and actions to pursue material opportunities, along with tracking their effectiveness.
The standard also emphasizes actions within the company's own control, right? Their own practices.
Absolutely. It's about disclosing how they try to avoid causing or contributing to negative impacts through their own planning, financing, land use, resource extraction, environmental management, etc. This includes being honest about tensions, like how they balance preventing impacts against business pressures, like hitting deadlines or cost targets. They also need to report on any severe human rights incidents involving communities, if they occurred.
Now, here's a really interesting connection. The source makes linking community impacts directly to environmental issues.
Yes, this is super important and really breaks down silos. The standard is explicit. Environmental issues covered in ESRS E1 to E5 can directly cause major social impacts for communities.
Can you give some examples from the standard?
Sure. Think about climate change. E1. A big push for renewables is great, but if those projects are built on indigenous lands without proper consultation and consent, that's a huge social impact violating FPIC.
Okay, what else?
Pollution, E2. Factory emissions polluting air or water. That directly harms community health. Water use, E3. A company sucking up lots of water in a water-stressed area can literally reduce the drinking water available for locals.
Biodiversity, E4.
Yeah, biodiversity loss isn't just about animals and plants. Soil contamination from operations can destroy local farmers' livelihoods. Paving over land for development might remove plants that are critical for local biodiversity and water filtration, impacting the whole ecosystem communities depend on. Even introducing invasive species can cause harm.
And waste, E5.
Mismanaging hazardous waste, E5. That can have direct, severe health consequences for nearby communities. So the standard says companies should cross-reference these environmental disclosures when they lead to social impacts.
Wow, so environmental problems aren't separate. They are social problems for affected communities. Health, livelihoods, rights, it's all connected.
Exactly. It forces a more holistic view of sustainability.
What about impacts further down the value chain, often outside a company's direct control?
Good question. S3 addresses this through the concept of leverage. Companies need to disclose how they use their influence in business relationships to tackle impacts linked to, say, suppliers or distributors.
Leverage meaning?
It's not just commercial clout, like threatening to cancel a contract. It can be relationship leverage, maybe offering training to suppliers on indigenous rights, or collaborative leverage, working with other companies or organizations on shared challenges, like improving security practices in a volatile region.
So using influence positively.
Right. They can also report on participating in industry initiatives aimed at these issues. And they need to explain how community impacts are considered if they have to end a relationship with a problematic supplier or partner.
You keep saying effectiveness. How do companies actually measure if their actions are working?
The standard suggests various ways. They might use internal or external audits, look at outcomes of legal cases, conduct specific impact assessments, gather stakeholder feedback, analyze complaints from grievance mechanisms, look at external ESG ratings, or benchmark against competitors.
What about actions aimed at positive impacts?
Yeah.
Like community development projects?
For those, they should disclose if communities were involved in the design and implementation. What were the intended outcomes, and what were the actual achieved outcomes, making a clear distinction between just doing activities and achieving real results. Why were these communities chosen? Are there links to the sustainable development goals like Does involving women in consultations support SDG 5 on gender equality?
Can positive actions also mitigate negative ones?
Yes, and they should mention that if it's the case. For example, maybe improving local roads near a facility not only helps the community generally, but also reduces traffic accidents involving company vehicles. That's a positive initiative mitigating a negative impact risk.
Okay, that covers actions. Finally, how does the standard push for measurable progress? That brings us to the last part, S3-5, metrics and targets.
Right. Companies need to disclose targets. These should be time-bound, so with deadlines and outcome-oriented, meaning focused on results.
Targets for what, specifically?
For reducing negative impacts, advancing positive impacts, and managing those material risks and opportunities we talked about.
The goal being to show clear direction and track progress.
Exactly. It points back to the general requirements for target setting in ESRS 2. But a really significant piece here under S3 is the requirement to explain how the targets were set.
How they were set, meaning.
Specifically, they need to disclose if and how they engaged directly with affected communities or their credible representatives when setting the targets. Did they also involve them in tracking performance against those targets and figuring out lessons learned?
So the standard is actually suggesting that the people most affected might ideally have a say in defining what success looks like and addressing the impacts on them.
It strongly encourages that transparency about the process, yes. It promotes the idea of co-creation or at least consultation in target setting. Companies also need to provide details like the specific intended outcomes for communities, whether targets are stable over time for comparison, and what standards or commitments they're based on.
Can targets for risks be different from impact targets?
They might be the same or distinct. For example, a target to restore livelihoods after a resettlement project that addresses both a positive impact goal and mitigates risks like protests or lawsuits.
And time frame.
Yes, they should distinguish between short, medium, and long-term targets. The standard gives an example like aiming for 100% local employment by 2025, maybe with interim yearly percentage goals. And if targets change, they need to explain why maybe the business model shifted or regulations changed.
Whew, that was a really thorough walkthrough of ESRS S3. If we had to boil it down, what's the absolute core message here?
I think the core idea really is this major push for companies to be way more transparent about their real-world tangible effects, good and bad, on the communities they touch. And that's everywhere, from their doorstep right down the longest supply chain.
Right. And the key things they need to show are identifying who's affected, paying special attention to vulnerable groups and indigenous peoples.
And proving they have the policies, the genuine engagement processes where community input actually matters, and working channels for concerns and remedy.
Plus, showing the concrete actions they're taking, clearly linking it all back to their core strategy, and importantly, showing that vital link between environmental actions and community well-being.
And finally, setting real, measurable targets to track progress, ideally involving communities in that process. It's quite a shift.
Yeah, it really feels like this moves beyond just, corporate social responsibility fluff. It's a framework demanding accountability for how business operations affect actual people's homes, jobs, rights, health, their lives. It forces companies to look squarely at the human side of their balance sheet, so to speak.
It definitely puts a much brighter spotlight on those connections, which were maybe easier to ignore before.
So here's a final thought then. As more companies start reporting under detailed standards like this, and all this information about community impacts becomes, public knowledge, how might that actually change things? How might that transparency influence your choices, maybe, about which companies you buy from or invest in, or even work for?
That's a great question.
And maybe even more importantly, what power does this kind of detailed public information give back to the communities themselves, the ones actually experiencing these impacts? What can they do with this information to better advocate for their own rights and well-being?